Welcome, everybody. Okay, welcome, everybody. Hello, everyone. I'm Chelsea Lake, and I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual event in the midst of these extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their books to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Known by Heart collected stories on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. While we'll try to get to everyone's question, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being with us here today. We're so grateful to our family of loyal customers, keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Prentiss Campbell is the author of the 2016 novel, The Bowl with Gold Seams, which won the Indy Excellence Award for Historical Fiction, and the short story collections Contents Under Pressure, which was nominated for the National Book Award, and Known by Heart. Her short fiction has been featured in numerous journals, including the Massachusetts Review and the MacGuffin. A member of the National Book Critics Circle, her essays and reviews appear in the Fiction Writers Review, where she is a contributing editor, the Washington Independent Review of Books, the New York Journal of Books, and others. Today, Campbell will be in conversation with Deborah Kalb, a freelance writer and editor. She spent 2 decades working as a journalist in Washington, D.C., mostly covering Congress and politics. Her book blog, Book Q&As with Deborah Kalb, features hundreds of interviews she has conducted with a wide variety of authors. Please welcome Prentiss Campbell and Deborah Kalb to PNB Live.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you to Politics and Prose, and thank you to Ellen for asking me to join her here today to talk about her writing. We're going to focus especially on her really wonderful collection of stories, Known by Heart. Ellen and I have known each other for a while now. We've talked about books endlessly when we get together. So I am really looking forward to a great discussion today. So Ellen, I wanted to just start out by, in terms of Known by Heart, you wrote these stories over a period of about 15 years. And I wanted to ask you whether you think that your topics or preoccupations in your writing changed at all over that period.
That's a good question, Deborah. You always ask good questions. I think that over the period of about 15 years that represents this collection, I think my core interest in writing about people who are in the midst of situations with other people they care about, whether they're difficulties or joys, that was a constant. But I think that as I wrote, it's also a constant that I see that in some ways my interest in getting behind the point of view of some of my older protagonists deepened. You know, I came back to writing, which was my first love, but I came back to writing after about 30 years practicing as a psychotherapist. So it's a funny sensation to say when I was beginning to write, because by the time I was beginning to write fiction seriously, I was already, fully engaged in issues that include the issues of family life and aging. But I do think over the period of time that these stories germinated, those issues deepened. I guess another thing that I think is true when you're working with characters or stories over time is that some characters seem to be living with you over even a long period of time. So that just as my experience as a writer was changing and deepening, I was coming to know some of these characters over and over again as they reappeared in my imagination, and appeared in my imagination often at a different point in their own lives.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I really love about your writing is that you bring characters back again, and they might appear as young people and then appear as middle-aged and then as older. And you see them from different vantage points, not just in terms of their age, but in terms of who's the protagonist in that particular story, from whose viewpoint you're telling their story. And I wanted to ask you about a couple of characters in particular right now, and then we can get to some of the others. Walker and Meg, who are characters who show up in a couple of stories in Known by Heart, but also have been in stories in your earlier collection, Contents Under Pressure, which is also an incredible collection that everybody should read. So I wondered if you could just talk about those characters, how they came to you, and what about them intrigued you enough to continue writing about them.
Oh, sure. Well, Walker and Meg were among the characters who first came to me. And it's often true in my fiction that there's a combination of influences that sort of generate a character and generate a story. Well, of course, there's no way a fiction writer is writing things that are completely devoid of her own experience. So that for me, often places I have lived are deeply part of the inspiration from my stories. And I did live with my husband and kids in a house that was deeply part of Megan Walker's story as well. So that in a way, Megan Walker's story started in part with the house that I inhabited and with the way that house had a way of attracting people who had lived in it previously to come back and say, oh, I used to live here, may I visit? So it began to give me this sense of there being other occupants in the house, Megan Walker among them.
Yeah.
And then, Megan Walker and Megan Walker aren't done with me yet, or I'm not done with Megan Walker yet, because there are still stories about them, in my file of stories in draft. And so it's a couple of times people have said to me, well, Megan Walker, maybe they should be a novel. And for folks who haven't read stories either in Contents Under Pressure or the stories in Known by Heart, Megan Walker are a couple with kids, and they appear at different times in their life in different stories. And then there are flashbacks within stories. So I come to know and reveal both what their earlier life was like as we're progressing with their present life. But they haven't seemed to me to be characters in a novel. They come, they are in a story, and then that story is done, but they come back to me. And I have the absolute opposite experience with characters in the two novels that I've written, one of which is The Bowl with Gold Seams, which was out and I read from it Politics and Prose. And my other novel, Frida's Song, will be published in May. But, in a novel, when the novel is finished, and I've been working continuously often on it for many years, both The Bowl with Gold Seams and Frida's Song ended up being the product of 10 years' work. When the novel is finished, there's a way in which the door to that character's life, the important character or characters in the book, is closed and completed, so that I don't have this same feeling that characters from The Bowl with Gold Seams are still revisiting me and asking me to write more. So it's a way, I guess, in which the novel writes itself and the characters complete that. But the short story kind of keeps going. There's another recurrent character in many of my stories who I wrote about him in the first collection. His name is Mr. Westervelt. He's a retired minister. I wrote about him in the first collection of stories. I've written a couple of stories about him that appear in this one. And this summer he reappeared to me, and I'm in the middle of working on a story, again, inspired by this person, by this character. And he was originally a good example of the way characters get suggested by people I've known in my life. You know, I knew someone who was a bit like this man, who lived in an old church, who ran an antique shop in it. And he was a real man that I had deep affection for. And so when I began writing stories, I think the stories were very much part of holding on to him as he aged, and before he died and after he died, so that he's another one of those recurring characters, like Megan Walker, you know, that you just you can't get away from them, partly because as an author I care about them.
Right, and you can tell by reading your work how much you care about your characters, and I love that about your work. It really comes through. Since you mentioned Reverend Westervelt, I thought maybe this might be a good time to read a little bit from the story Surprise Boxes, which is one of the stories in the new collection where he appears as a character. So maybe you could read a little bit now.
Sure, I will. And you know, the stories in Known by Heart are sort of linked by a theme of being unconventional love stories. And I say unconventional love stories because they're by no means bodice rippers, and they're about different kinds of people and different kinds of love, siblings and friends and partners like Megan Walker, and then a character like Reverend Westervelt, who seems in a way to be someone who loves everyone who walks into this store he runs. But there's always a backstory, and I'm always curious about the backstory. But let me read to you from Surprise Boxes. The dean approved my petition to withdraw. I stripped my room in the freshman dorm. The Greyhound bus carried me home to Bedford through a freak April snowstorm. I slept like a hibernating beast the first week, and would have liked to sleep straight through the spring, hiding in my room, but my mother pushed me out of bed. Heavy and slow, as though walking underwater, I dressed and brushed my limp hair to please her. I felt erased, the past months flushed away without a trace. Enough moping. Go make yourself useful to Mr. Westervelt. It was easier not to refuse. So I walked to the church Mr. Westervelt had converted to his home and antique shop. He had retired and moved to town the year I was 10. I'm a retired minister living in a retired church, he liked to say. My mother said he had retired early and wasn't old, but he seemed old to me. His shop was my after-school refuge until high school. I abandoned him for drama club, yearbook, and a summer job at the Frosty Bear, selling soft serve ice cream to blonde boys on the football team. Now I walked through his church door again. The bell on the doorknob announced me just as always. He was reading at the cash register and put down his book. He looked more like Lincoln than ever, thin face and deep-set eyes, until he smiled. Oh, you have perfect timing. I have just been to a big auction and could use some help sorting. My favorite task had always been sorting purchases from estate sales and auctions, opening the cartons, unwrapping objects from layers of old newspaper had seemed like Christmas. Let me give you a tour, refresh your memory as to where things go. The sanctuary was crammed with table linens, sheet music, books, buttons, old postcards, and costume jewelry. His inventory was always more junk than antiques, except for the glass-fronted cabinet of bone china. I still have my weakness for fine china. Can't ever let a pretty piece go unclaimed, no matter if it's chipped or cracked. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Once I had been in the shop when a customer exclaimed, "My grandmother's pattern," as though her grandmother was restored to her with the pink flowered saucer. It did seem almost possible in the clutter of his shop to find something precious that had been lost. I don't think I'm up for a trip to the basement. My hip's a bit gimpy today. Check it out, then we can get to the garage and start work. The basement was as I remembered, a dark catacomb of little rooms packed with tools and pots and pans, coffee percolators, bottles, canning jars. I climbed back upstairs. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," I replied. "Well, no rest for the wicked," he said. We walked through the shop and kitchen, out the back door into the garage. The big folding table he kept for sorting was covered with boxes. "I'm behind, glad you're here." I fished in the cartons, handed each item over, and watched him write a price on a sticky circular label. "This treasure is ready for the floor. Find it a spot." We worked as a team. It was mostly junk, but he said, "For every sock, there's a foot." And I found each piece its place, like with like, in the choir loft, the sanctuary, or the basement. As I worked, I remembered it being like a scavenger hunt in reverse. And I remembered as I fell into the familiar quiet rhythm of working together, how I used to tell him about what I was reading, and he recited poetry. "Parting is all we know of heaven, and all we need of hell," was the line that came back to me now, his voice in my mind's ear. I almost wanted to tell him what I had learned in college about love, and to ask him if he thought I would go to hell for what I had done. Thank you.
That is really beautiful. I mean, your writing just gives such a sense of detail and of place. And yeah, you really feel like you're right there with them in the store, in the church. So
And I think, Deborah, that's part of what I love about the experience of writing, and this may be true for you too, when you're recapturing history the way you do with your books, that I love that feeling of being able to be in that moment, in that place.
yeah,
And that happens frequently.
absolutely. No, I agree. I mean, I feel the same way. And I think, when you have a character like Reverend Westervelt and he comes back again in other stories, do you feel like each time he has changed a little, or do you feel like he is the same, but he's being perceived at a different time or different by a different person? Like, what is your sense about him as a character?
My sense about him as a character is that he has changed over time, and that he has this this persona of gentleness and goodness, but that something that's always part of him is his own struggle with himself. And in the stories about him, part of what I've loved is looking back into his past or his own regrets, and getting a sense of how he's carried those losses forward into his life. And similarly with Meg and Walker, Meg and Walker are difficult people, and they're difficult with each other as well as just difficult people. But part of what I really am attracted to is writing about prickly people, because I think there's just a lot of energy for all of us under the surface, and a lot of unexpressed difficulty and prickliness. And I like getting in there. And, with Mr. Westervelt, for example, the story that he's demanding me to write now is one that was really inspired this summer by an unfortunate incident in the small town that is very much like the small town he lived in. And so I really have this sense of his saying, you've got to write about my response to this incident, because I want to stand up and be counted against this wrongful incident. So I feel like he's coming back to me and saying, you've got to give me a chance to be counted here. And with Meg and Walker, over the course of the stories in this book, became, instead of parents of young people, they became people who were very much involved in the care of elders, and then in saying goodbye to elders. And I think that seeing how that changed them was part of the fascination of writing about them again.
What about your character, Grace? Can you talk a little about her, because she's another character that appears in more than one story?
Well, let me, with her, she's a character who appears in more than one story, and then in the story she appears in, there are often, in some of the stories she appears in, it's later in her life, and she has dementia, so that she is suffering in the later stories from dementia, and it's only through flashbacks that I, as a writer, can reveal what she was like earlier in her life. And I think Grace is a character who's very, very close to my heart, written on my heart. All these characters are known in my heart, which is partly where the title comes from. But Grace, both as a younger woman and then later as a woman with dementia, is very much, for me, inspired by some aspects of my own mother's life. And in her later life, she too had dementia. And then also, Grace is just a person on her own. And I guess I should say, this is sort of like that disclaimer in the movies where they say no animals were harmed in the making of these movies. But I guess I should say about Grace, about Reverend Westervelt, about Walker and Meg, all of the people in my stories and my novels, they're people who, in part, of course, are inspired by people I've either known or encountered, but they are their own people. So although Grace is deeply inspired by my mom, although Reverend Westervelt was deeply inspired by a man I knew in a small town, they are their own people. But I think with Grace, I was really eager to have an opportunity to write a story where I could see the struggle both of Grace to remain herself, even as she was losing herself to dementia. And I wanted to see the way that her changes inspired changes in her partner, Alan, because again, we know them in earlier stories. We know them in a story at the end of their life, and then we know them through their daughter's eyes, because their daughters also appear as characters in stories in their own right.
Yeah.
So I think it's a way of wanting to give a character their due, that even though a story may be written about someone when they're at one moment in time, that's not the whole life. And I think that also comes, Deborah, out of my experience as a social worker and a psychotherapist.
Exactly. No, I was going to ask you about that. Like, how do you feel that your experience as a therapist affects your writing?
I think that it affects it and affected it in many ways. I think one way it affects it is it it gave me a very deep appreciation for the fact that everyone, all of us, has known trouble of different sorts, in different degrees, but there is no one who has not known trouble, and to really be respectful of that. And I think another way in which the work deeply influenced my writing is, my work as a therapist was really all about listening to the person I was working with as they worked on what had brought them to that moment, to be sitting with me, listening to them, trying to help them to express what was troubling and trying to help them work through that. And so there was a deep kind of listening that I was doing every day. And I think that listening and that receptiveness to listening, for me, is really part of what informs the work on stories and the novels too. I have a group of wonderful writer friends that I've met as one of those COVID silver linings, in that we didn't know each other before COVID, but we've come together once a week, almost throughout the time of COVID, talking both about our lives and our work. And I had an interesting experience. I love meeting and talking with these women, and I have learned so much from them. But we tried, and I tried a few times, to meet together in a quiet Zoom room and write together. And for some, I think it worked splendidly. But what I realized for me is I have to be alone with my characters, because very often when I'm writing, I'm talking aloud, either as the character or to the character, but I'm talking within this closed room, sort of the way when I did my work as a therapist, I would be working with my client within a very private, closed space. And I also have to say, one huge thing is there is a complete firewall between my clients, my past clients, and my work. That the work comes out of my person, and that the work as a therapist was and will forever remain completely separate from that in terms of stories. I listened to stories for 30 years, but now I'm telling the stories that come to me. I'm telling my stories.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. You alluded to this a little earlier about the title of the collection, Known by Heart. And I remember you telling me when we were doing an interview about the book last year that you originally thought of calling it Love Letters Written in Lemon Juice. And so I wondered how you got from Love Letters Written in Lemon Juice to Known by Heart.
Well, titling books is such an interesting thing, and you've established sort of a neat workaround with your series of books about the presidents for kids, in that you keep reworking the same title. I may steal that from you, because titling is tricky. What happened with Known by Heart was all the time I was writing, I didn't know that these stories would come together as a collection, any more than when I was writing the stories that came together as the earlier collection, Contents Under Pressure, I knew for sure which stories would come together as a collection. So part of what happened with the title of Known by Heart was I had these stories, most of them already stories that were involving recurring characters, and were beginning to fall together into a bit of a collection. And then there were some new stories, but I wasn't sure that they were a collection. And I had an experience. I went to a literary festival, and my husband and I heard a wonderful poet read, and I loved his poetry. And then after his reading, his name is Todd Davis. I just love his poetry. I loved his reading. We fell into conversation in email after his reading, And he talked to me about his recent process of putting together a collection of poems. And he said, they just began to fall together as he considered them as a whole. So I literally took all these stories and I spread them out. I no longer live in a house, so I don't have a ping pong table anymore, but I spread them out on our bed, and I began shuffling them around, and I began realizing, these are all love stories. I mean, they're not conventional love stories, and many of them, the love is intermingled with loss, but they're all love stories. And another of my favorite poems came to mind, and I love this poem, and there is a line in it where the poet says, "Love letters written in lemon juice." And I thought, aha, some of these stories are about lost love letters written in lemon juice. That's perfect. So, fresh from my wonderful correspondence with Todd Davis, I wrote to this other poet who shall remain nameless. And I said, I have loved your poem such and such for so long. I would like to use a line in that poem for the title of this collection of stories. And I never heard back from him. So be it. So then I wondered, well, what should be the title? What should be the title? And it was just clear as a bell to me finally. Did you ever play, you may be too young to have ever played with a magic 8-ball?
Oh, I remember the
You remember the magic 8-ball?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I loved that magic 8-ball. And you would ask it a question and the answer would just float up.
Right.
So it was like I was so stuck and so disappointed, and I was looking at my stories, and there is that story about Alan and Grace, two of my recurring characters who I am deeply, deeply connected to. And the title of their story, one of their stories, is Known by Heart. And I was like, this collection is going to be called Known by Heart. And it is, and it was. But I wasn't quite done yet because, as you know, Deborah, because we've talked about the naming of books, I'm not very experienced with the naming of books. I've only named 4, but my experience with the naming of books is increasingly one where I realize you have to be careful. When I named my first collection of stories, it was completely clear to me that it was to be called Contents Under Pressure. All the women in those stories were under pressure. It was perfect. The cover illustration by a wonderful artist named Kevin Cutts shows a woman under great pressure. And so I called it Contents Under Pressure. Well, it wasn't until it was published and I was Googling around that I learned Contents Under Pressure is a very popular title for plumbing supply books. And I thought, oh no, plumbing supply books. But someone in a book group said, don't worry, women have plumbing problems. And so that was Contents Under Pressure. I still love the title. And The Bowl with Gold Seams, my first novel, I had called it The Japanese at the Springs the whole time I was working on it. But a very good final reader said, you can't call that book that. It sounds like a travel book. And so it came to be named after the Kintsugi bowl in the book. And that was very much the right title for it. And Known by Heart, it just seems like it is finally the right title for this book, because they are unconventional love stories. Many of them do have sorrow in them as well. And they are stories that are really written on my heart, characters that are written on my heart.
Yeah. And I am excited by your new novel that's going to be out soon called Frida's Song. And
Yes.
That is about the life of a psychiatrist named Frida from Reichman, who left Nazi Germany, came to Maryland, to Rockville, and worked in Chestnut Lodge, which was a psychiatric institution. And I wanted you to, first of all, if you could tell us how you got interested in her and in Chestnut Lodge, and then perhaps read a little bit from the book.
Oh, I would love to. And Deborah, and all of you who are so kindly here tonight, this book event is a wonderful event, and it comes in the midst of this strange COVID year. Deborah and I first thought we would be together with you almost a year ago, and Politics and Prose was all set, and then the world changed. So I'm in this wonderful, funny moment where this event with you all tonight is like a party for known by heart, and it's also almost a little bit like a slightly early baby shower for my novel Frida's Song, which isn't going to be published until late May. But I'm really delighted to talk a little bit about that new book baby that's coming. And I became interested in Frida Fromm-Reichmann in a couple of ways. As I've already said, talking about how important the house that I used to live in was to me in terms of inspiring me to write stories about people that I imagined after people who used to live in the house started coming to visit us. So Frida's Song was also partly inspired by a place. Places are the containers of our lives. And that's why I think houses and old ruins are so evocative, for me at least as a writer. So when I lived in the old part of Rockville, in that house, which is very much like Alan and Grace's house and very much like other people's houses who have lived in it, I lived very near the Chestnut Lodge. And the Chestnut Lodge was still, when we first lived there, it was still a psychiatric hospital, and it had been a landmark in the Rockville community for over 100 years. I was also at that time a practicing psychotherapist, not at Chestnut Lodge, but at a clinic in nearby Rockville. And there were occasions once a year where there would be a wonderful symposium on the grounds of the Chestnut Lodge, where there would be lectures, and it would be out of doors, and it always seemed to be good weather. And we would wander around the grounds, which were beautiful. And I also lived close enough by so that even when the time came that the Chestnut Lodge had closed and was no longer actually providing care, neighbors like myself, we would still go walking on those beautiful grounds. We would walk around the closed hospital. We would see the little white house on the lawn next to the cottage, next to the hospital, which was a cottage that had been built for a famous psychiatrist, Frida Fromm-Reichmann. And so the Chestnut Lodge had a real deep meaning to me, both as a neighbor and as a therapist, and as someone who just loves old houses and old buildings. And then as time went along, there were different plans for what would happen with Chestnut Lodge. None of them came to fruition. But the little white cottage on that green lawn was purchased and restored by the Historic Society Peerless Rockville, which was magnificent. And they were interested in it because Frida Fromm-Reichmann, the psychiatrist who had come there in 1935 from Nazi Germany, that cottage had been custom built for her because she made herself so important so quickly to the sanatorium that they wanted to keep her there. And the cottage, designed to her specifications, was her home for the rest of her life. So she lived in it from 1935 to when she died in 1957. And then it was used for offices, and then it fell into disrepair. But it was restored, it was reopened, and I was fascinated by the fact that Frida's cottage had been restored and reopened and rented. Someone was living in it, not me. I'll admit, I love old houses, and there was a temptation thinking, oh my goodness, but Frida's cottage, no, never lived in it. But then what really started me down the trail of writing this new novel is One morning in June of 2009, my husband and I woke up smelling smoke. And what, of course, we were smelling was the terrible fire that had started early in that morning, that June morning, and destroyed the former Chestnut Lodge Hospital. And as neighbors, we gathered and saw the ruin of the hospital. And as neighbors, we marveled that the cottage, recently restored by Peerless Rockville, had survived, just yards from the hospital that had burned. So that was 2009, and the timing was auspicious in that I had just finished work on my first novel, and I was sort of ready for another project. So the fact that there was this remarkable cottage that was connected with this renowned psychiatrist intrigued me, and I began researching. And you know better than I, Deborah, as a former journalist and as a writer and editor of history, that the research just takes hold of you.
Yeah.
It just takes hold of you. And I couldn't stop doing the research, and I couldn't stop writing.
I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And maybe you could read a little bit for us. And then we have a few questions in the Q&A, and we can get to questions now from the audience. If anyone else has questions to put into the Q&A, please do so. And we'll get to as many as possible. But yeah, Ellen, please read a section.
I will. So I will read. And I should just tell you that this is a sneak peek. As I said, this book won't even be published till May. So I'm so happy you're here, and I'm so happy to have a chance to read to you. I'm going to read a few pages from very close to the beginning of the book. When you read the book, as I hope you all will, and you'll see it's told in 3 parts. It's told by Frida. It's told by a current day therapist who lives now in Frida's restored cottage, and by that therapist's teenage son. But the part I'm going to read to you today is just a short passage from very soon after Frida Fromm-Reichmann has come from Germany. She came from Germany with the help of her estranged husband, who was already in the States, Erich Fromm. He had been her student, and he was already then more famous than she, and is in some circles more famous than she, but not mine. Frida is more famous in my heart. Erich Fromm had helped her come to the States, and so she had come to New York. She had traveled with a very dear friend of hers, a psychiatrist who was also an artist, whose name is Gertrude Jacob. But in this passage, you will just meet Frida and Erich and the director of the lodge and his wife. So Frida and Erich are leaving from New York. He has found her a part-time job for the summer. They think it's just temporary at the Chestnut Lodge. I leave for Maryland with my suitcase, my box of records, Gertrude's ugly painting of me wrapped in a blanket. Erich carries just his familiar leather rucksack, the book bag he slung across his slender shoulders as a student in my class, now holds the few items he needs for the weekend. He will soon be free of me again. At Penn Station, Erich hails a Negro porter, a red cap, he calls him. Gertrude would love the reflective skin. I recall the Rembrandt in the Rijksmuseum, shadowy portrait of an African man. The porter catches me staring, and I look away. He trundles my suitcase and box down the platform. I carry Gertrude's painting. My God, she has you to the life, Erich had exclaimed when I showed him, not telling him it was meant to be me. So that's how I look to him. Une belle led, so that's how I look. We board. The conductor says something unintelligible. My mind tires of wrapping itself around English. That's the problem, not my hearing. Erich reaches into his breast pocket for the leather travel wallet. Embossed EF, my gift when he left for the clean, healing air of the cure in Switzerland, with his ticket to leave me, the train ticket I'd paid for, slipped into the soft leather pocket. He returned, cured of the TB and of me. Breathing is so simple. All you need is a pump and a bellows. When pumps and bellows go bad, some can be repaired. Not so easy with the switchboard of intellect, instinct, and emotion, nerves and impulses. Patching up the detritus of the trenches after the Somme, I did my best with damaged brains. I could never eat calf's brains again. What haunted me after any possible patching and mending was done was the damage done to the intangible mind. What could be done for the tangle of memory, thoughts, and dreams? That challenge has become my life's work. The director, Dr. Bullard, and his wife meet us at Union Station, drive us past the fountain. Christopher Columbus, she says, drive us in their enormous car past buildings like temples. The Capitol, she says, the Supreme Court just completed, the Lincoln Memorial and the Memorial to Jefferson will be there, she says. They've just started building it. Strange, seeing the foundation for the new memorial, like a ruin in reverse, going up instead of down. She and I sit in the back, the men in the front. Eric, animated, chats in a stream of rapid English I don't try to follow. Always, I will remember my first glimpse of the lodge. Tall, elegant building looming in the dark beneath its mansard roof, long windows alight, reminding me of my own hospital, my therapeuticum. We live next door, the director's wife said. It's chaos in our house, so we have arranged for you to stay in a room we keep in the hospital for patients' families when they visit. A room? Does she think Eric and I share a room, a bed? Has Eric explained? We're walking down the corridor. What to say? And I'll leave them there until May. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to talk about these stories and to give you a little peek at Frida.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely worth reading. So I will try now to turn to the questions from the audience, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. We probably have about 10 minutes. So Ellen, your sense of place is so rich and deep. This is from Joanne. I particularly love that the places you write about, at least some of them, are places I have been. I am particularly interested in your vast and detailed descriptions of the local flora and fauna as you describe the settings. Do you research these, or are you naturally versed in the local botany?
You know, I'm fortunate when I'm in Pennsylvania in that we've been going there for 50 years. And so I really know the local flora and fauna there, partly because I learned it from my family, partly because I learned it from dear friends who were wonderful naturalists. It's harder for me when I'm dealing with an area I don't know, but then I do try and find out. But mostly I write about places I know deeply.
Yeah. So another audience member asked, what are the short story collections that inspired you the most throughout writing this book?
Oh, I love short stories. Alice Munro is just, you know, on a pedestal for me. I think her stories are worlds in and of themselves. Another writer whose stories I think are really wonderful, surprisingly, because she's also known for her children's books, is Mary Norton. She wrote The Borrowers, but she's also written wonderful, wonderful short stories. And I return to her short stories often. Another one of my absolutely favorite authors, both for short stories and novels, is William Maxwell. And William Maxwell's sense of sort of the vein of sorrow underneath everything is something that I just resonate with.
So Jane asks, you don't feel a need to make your characters likable so the readers will be invested and will want to follow that character? And the question refers to your comment on writing about prickly people.
I think that's a really tough question. I think sometimes I do have to struggle to make sure that the character doesn't become so prickly that he or she pushes people away. But I think it's, honestly, I think when you're writing or when I'm writing, it's so much like when you're getting to know someone, that once you really get to know someone, you know what a mixture they are. And so that if the character is fully developed, if I've done it right, if the character has really, really spoken to me deeply enough and I've listened hard enough, I come to care about them. And then I think the reader can come to care about them.
Yeah, I mean, you do an amazing job with that. You obviously, you care about them and I care about them, and I'm sure everyone else who reads.
And I feel like we have an advantage as writers in that then we can go inside the character so that the reader realizes that prickly external is not all there is.
Yeah, definitely. So Judy has a question. What's your favorite moment when you're revising? What's the moment in revision you like the least?
Oh, the moment in revising I like the least is when I'm faced with the messy pile of pages and I know I've got to start, and it's really hard to make myself start. But once I've started, I love it, because I love working at the level of the word and just getting it more and more and more and more the way it feels like it should be. I read aloud a lot when I'm working, and so once I've started, I'm fine. But until I've started, I'm anything but fine. And I don't know about you, Deborah, but that's been hard during the pandemic because I can't go to the library.
Right.
I can't go anywhere, so I'm always at home in my wonderful study, but I can always get up and take out the trash or rearrange the something.
Right, exactly. Well, another question from Mary is related to that question. When do you know when to stop revising? She asked, I understand your Bowl book was rewritten many times.
That's a good question. And I would say there, I think as a writer, and Deborah, who talks to literally hundreds of writers over the course of a year, is really the one to answer this. But I think what helps me then is it's not a solo process. I must, at a certain point in the process, when it's polished enough and readable enough, I must turn it over to other eyes and have other eyes advise me as to, am I far enough along? Do I need to go farther? So that to finally know, I have to be the one to decide, but there's an intermediate point where I really desperately need feedback. Maybe that's true for you too, Deborah.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I get to the point where I feel like, yeah, I've gone over this and over this and over this and over this and made this change and that change. And yeah, it's time for someone else to look at it. So Judy has another really nice comment, which I totally agree with, that says the new book is so great, which it is. So I agree with that. A question from Liza, did publishing your first book change your process of writing?
No, and you know what? Liza, it also didn't change my life. It's like so many other things. It's like when I was 12 maybe or 11, I was sure if I got pierced ears, it would change my life. And guess what, guys? Didn't change my life. And there've been a lot of other life-changing moments that haven't quite changed my life. It didn't change my process of writing, but it made me feel like a writer in a new way. It did not change my process of writing, though. And what's really wonderful is just when you start writing again and you get into the writing and you remember, this is really fun. I mean, it's hard work, but this is really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have two more questions that I guess we'll have to give Ellen just a minute on each one because we're getting to the end. One of them is, what are the key differences between writing short stories and writing a novel? How different is the editing process? And the last question, do you wake up in the morning or set aside a certain time of day or night to begin writing, or do you write when the mood strikes you?
For me, the differences between short stories and novel, the short stories are something that feels more complete. I don't write poetry, but I imagine that perhaps it's a little bit more like poetry in that there's a sense of completion in the story, even if the characters are going to reoccur someplace else, not yet known to me. And the editing of a short story is something where I, even more than in a novel, can get down to the level of the word. And I love that, but it can also be a trap. With the novel, for me, a novel is a long, baggy process. And it's something I do best at if I'm working on it every day. But it's a more forgiving process in that I can come back to it over and over again and keep working on it and tell myself, I'm going to make that right, but later, I'm going to make that right, but later. And I feel like with the short story, it's not that sense of having enough time. A short story is like pushing its way to get written and done in a different way. And I guess that toggles on to the other question. When I was still working as a psychotherapist, I very much set aside the early morning hours to get up before I went to work and write. And that was wonderful. It is equally wonderful now that I am retired from my work as a therapist, that I am able to have more time. I'm much more a daytime person than nighttime. So for me, it's still morning that I tend to protect for my writing. But I'll be honest with you and say it's really wonderful that I don't have to get up at 5 a.m. anymore to do it.
Well, that's, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ellen. I mean, these were wonderful answers. And
oh, and Deborah, thank you. And Chelsea, thanks to Politics and Prose.
Thank you, Politics.
And I do just want to say Politics and Prose is so special. Thank you for making books like mine have a place. And thank you for having books like Deborah's wonderful children's story have places.
Thank you.
Thank you for having real books on real shelves, even though it's a pandemic.
Well, thank you. A big thank you to you both, Ellen Prentiss Campbell and Deborah Kalb, for joining us this evening. Thank you all for coming. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this, and we cannot continue to host events like this without the book sales to support them. So please support Ellen, Deborah, and Politics and Prose by using the links in the chat for their latest creations. Please also visit our website for the most up-to-date event listings. We do hope to see you there. Thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you again to our wonderful speakers, Ellen Prentiss Campbell and Deborah Kalb. Stay well read, everyone, and we'll see you next time.